If you clicked on this video, there's a reason. Something about the past pulls at you. Not just dates and ruins, but the feeling that something is missing. That there are pieces of the human story we were never told. And in 2025, something extraordinary happened. The past didn't just whisper to us anymore. It shouted. This was the year ancient cities appeared where no one thought cities could exist. The year lost people re-entered history after thousands of years of silence. The year scientists finally learned how to read books burned by a volcano 2 millennia ago. And here's the part most people don't realize yet. These discoveries didn't just add details to history. They changed the story entirely. So if you've ever felt that history was incomplete, if you've ever wondered how much we don't know, then you're in the right place. Because what we uncovered in 2025 forces us to ask a dangerous question. What else have we been wrong about? Settle in. Let the outside world fade away for a while. This is not just a list of discoveries. This is the year the past fought back. For decades, archaeologists believed that large, complex cities could not exist in certain environments. Dense jungles, flood-prone valleys, remote regions with no stone architecture. The logic seemed solid. Cities need roads. They need planning. They need permanence. And yet, in 2025, one discovery after another proved that logic wrong. It started deep in South America, in a place most people have never heard of, the Yupano Valley in eastern Ecuador. For generations, researchers knew something was there. They found broken pottery, small mounds, scattered clues. But on foot, the jungle was unforgiving. Thick vegetation erased everything beyond a few meters. What looked like a hill could be natural or artificial. There was no way to tell. Until now. Using advanced laser scanning technology, scientists did something revolutionary. They digitally removed the forest. And what appeared underneath stunned everyone. This wasn't a village. It wasn't even a collection of villages. It was a vast urban network stretching across more than 100 square miles. Thousands of platforms, over 6,000 of them, arranged in precise geometric patterns. Straight roads slicing through hills and ravines. Planned neighborhoods. Central plazas. This was a city built not from stone, but from earth itself. Homes once stood on raised platforms to protect them from flooding. Ceremonial buildings rose above the landscape. Wide roads connected settlements miles apart, built so straight that they required cutting through terrain instead of following it. This wasn't accidental growth. This was design. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If cities this large existed here, how many more are still hidden? The people who lived in the Yupano Valley didn't leave pyramids or temples carved in rock. They built with soil, wood, and labor. Materials that disappear under centuries of rain and roots. Without modern technology, Their entire civilization looked like nothing more than natural hills. For over 1,000 years, tens of thousands of people lived here, farmed here, traded here, celebrated here, and then they vanished. Not because they failed, but because history forgot how to see them. This discovery alone would have made 2025 remarkable. But it was only the beginning. Half a world away, another long-held belief was about to collapse. For centuries, historians described the Eurasian steppe as the land of nomads, horse riders, seasonal camps, temporary shelters. The story was simple. These people moved constantly. They didn't build cities. They didn't settle. But in late 2025, that story broke apart. In northeastern Kazakhstan, faint shapes had appeared decades earlier in declassified Cold War satellite images. Straight lines, rectangles, patterns too organized to be natural. For years, no one could investigate properly. Until now, using drones and underground scanning tools, archaeologists revealed something astonishing. A Bronze Age city covering nearly 350 acres. This wasn't a camp. It wasn't seasonal huts. It was a fully planned metropolis. Rows of permanent houses built in a strict grid. A massive central structure dominating the city's heart. Dedicated industrial zones. Someone had planned this place before it was built. Even more shocking was what they found on the city's edge. Slag, broken crucibles, metal waste. This was not a farming town. This was an industrial powerhouse. The city specialized in bronze production, not small-scale tools, but high-quality alloys requiring rare materials. Tin had been transported hundreds of miles to reach this site. That means trade networks existed here long before the famous Silk Road. Entire supply chains crossed the steppe, linking distant regions through this city. The so-called nomads weren't primitive wanderers. They were engineers, planners, industrial specialists. They simply chose mobility until they didn't. And when they settled, they built something powerful enough to dominate an entire region. History didn't erase them because they failed. History erased them because they didn't fit the story. While lost cities emerged from forests and grasslands, another breakthrough was happening in a place already famous. A place millions of people visit every year. Petra. For over 2 centuries, tourists walked past the iconic treasury carved into pink sandstone, photographed it, admired it, moved on. Everyone assumed the site was fully understood. It was. Beneath the plaza, radar scans detected empty spaces, hidden chambers. Excavation was approved, a rare event at such a protected site. And beneath the stone, archaeologists uncovered something untouched. A sealed tomb. Inside were the skeletal remains of 12 individuals, buried together beneath one of the most famous monuments on Earth. This wasn't random. It was royal. For decades, scholars debated the purpose of the treasury. A temple, a symbolic facade, a storehouse. The presence of a pristine tomb beneath it finally tipped the scale. This was a mausoleum, a place built not just to impress the living, but to honor the dead. And because the tomb was sealed, something rare happened. DNA could be recovered. For the first time, scientists could study the actual biological remains of Nabatean royalty, a people who built an empire on trade, water engineering, and desert survival. A civilization known more by its architecture than its people. Until now. By this point in the year, archaeologists realized something important. 2025 wasn't just productive. It was connected. Across continents, across disciplines, the same pattern appeared again and again. Civilizations we thought were small were large. People we thought were simple were complex. Histories we thought were complete were missing entire chapters. And then in Italy, the past did something almost poetic. It began to speak. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it didn't just destroy towns. It sealed them. At Herculaneum, volcanic mud locked an entire Roman library in darkness. Hundreds of scrolls carbonized, fragile, unreadable. For centuries, scholars tried to open them. They failed. The scrolls crumbled at the slightest touch. But in recent years, something changed. Instead of opening the scrolls, scientists scanned them. Using powerful imaging tools and artificial intelligence, they learned how to read ink that couldn't be seen by the human eye. In 2025, that technology reached maturity. Entire passages were decoded. Words last read before the Roman Empire even existed emerged again. Philosophy, arguments, human thoughts frozen in time. We weren't just learning about the past anymore. We were listening to it. And as researchers scale this process, one truth becomes unavoidable. We may soon recover books we assumed were lost forever. Works by ancient thinkers whose names survived, but whose voices were silent until now. By the end of 2025, it was impossible to deny. This wasn't a normal year. The ground beneath our understanding of history had shifted. Cities were bigger, trade networks older, knowledge more fragile and more recoverable than we ever imagined. And we were only getting started. Because as the land revealed its secrets, the sea was about to do the same. Before we go any further, I want you to think about something. At some point in your life, you were probably taught that civilization followed a clear path, that humans slowly figured things out, that cities appeared only when conditions were just right. Good soil, stone for building, stable climates, clear borders, and anything outside those rules. That was labeled impossible. But if you're watching this, you already sense the truth. You felt it, that history feels too neat, too clean, like something was edited out. In 2025, that feeling was justified. Because this was the year, archaeologists found cities where cities were never supposed to exist. And once you see them, it becomes impossible to unsee how fragile our old assumptions really were. After the revelations in the Amazon and the Eurasian steppe, researchers started asking a dangerous question. What if we've been looking in the wrong places this entire time? For generations, archaeology focused on stone temples, stone walls, stone monuments, because stone survives. But most human societies didn't have endless stone. They had earth, wood, mud, labor. And those civilizations didn't disappear because they failed. They disappeared because their cities melted back into the land. One of the clearest examples came from Southeast Asia. For years, scholars knew ancient people lived in the dense jungles of the region. Artifacts turned up occasionally. Small mounds, broken ceramics, but nothing suggested large-scale urban life. The jungle was simply too thick, too chaotic, too wet. Then laser scanning technology changed everything. By stripping away the canopy digitally, archaeologists revealed something no one expected. A massive network of platforms, canals, and roads hidden beneath the trees. Not scattered settlements, but a planned landscape. Entire neighborhoods arranged with intention. Water systems engineered to control floods. Agricultural zones feeding dense populations. This wasn't jungle survival. This was urban mastery. The people who lived here didn't fight the environment. They redesigned it. Fields were drained and redirected. Settlements were raised above flood levels. Causeways connected communities across swampy terrain. What shocked researchers most wasn't the size. It was the precision. Straight lines don't happen by accident in a rainforest. They happen when people know exactly what they're building and why. And this discovery forced historians to confront an uncomfortable reality. We underestimated ancient people, not because they lacked intelligence, but because we lacked imagination. That same pattern appeared again, this time beneath the waves. If you stand on the coast near Alexandria today, the sea looks calm, endless, empty. But beneath that surface lies one of the most dramatic stories of loss in human history. A city swallowed whole. For over 1,000 years, Canopus existed only in ancient texts. A place of celebration and excess. A gateway between worlds. A city famous for both devotion and indulgence. Then it vanished. Earthquakes shook the Nile Delta. The ground liquefied. Temples slid into the sea. And history moved on. In 2025, underwater archaeologists returned to the ruins with better tools and more patience. What they found rewrote everything we knew about the city's final moments. Buried in sediment, they uncovered a colossal statue carved from quartzite, one of the hardest stones known in the ancient world. A sphinx, Not broken, not eroded, but astonishingly preserved. Its polished surface still reflected light underwater, and carved into it was the name of a pharaoh who ruled centuries before the city even reached its peak. This wasn't decoration. It was memory, an heirloom brought from the distant past to give legitimacy to a living city. But the statue wasn't alone. Surrounding it were ritual objects frozen in place: offering tables, ceremonial tools, sacred molds shaped like the god Osiris. These weren't random artifacts. They were the physical remains of one of the most important religious festivals in ancient Egypt, a ceremony of death and rebirth performed on water. For the first time, archaeologists could reconstruct not just the city's layout, but its spiritual life. The sounds, the rituals, the emotions. And suddenly, Canopus wasn't a myth anymore. It was a living place, right up until the moment the earth betrayed it. While cities were re-emerging from land and sea, another discovery was unfolding at a much smaller scale. One that didn't involve monuments or roads, but bones. For decades, scientists believed the story of human migration into South America was straightforward. People arrived. They spread. They diversified. But in 2025, genetic research shattered that simplicity. By analyzing ancient DNA from hundreds of skeletons across Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, researchers noticed something strange: a genetic signature that didn't belong to any known population. Not modern, not ancient Andean, not Amazonian. A ghost lineage. These people lived in the open grasslands of central Argentina, a region where populations should have mixed easily. But they didn't. For nearly 5,000 years, this group remained genetically isolated. They hunted, adapted, buried their dead with care. They survived climate shifts that wiped out megafauna. They redesigned their tools. They endured. And then, around 1,000 years ago, they vanished. No written records, no names, no surviving descendants. An entire people erased so completely that only their DNA remembered them. This wasn't just a scientific discovery. It was a reminder. History doesn't only forget events. It forgets people. And without modern technology, these lives would have remained invisible forever. By now, a pattern was impossible to ignore. Every major discovery of 2025 shared the same lesson. The past is not quiet. It has simply been hard to hear. And nowhere was that clearer than in the ruins of Herculaneum. When Vesuvius erupted, it didn't burn everything. In some places, it sealed it. A Roman villa buried under volcanic mud preserved something no other site on Earth could. A library, hundreds of scrolls, carbonized by heat but protected from decay. For centuries, scholars tried to open them and failed. The ink was invisible, the papyrus too fragile. Then artificial intelligence entered the story. By scanning the scrolls in extreme detail, scientists learned how to detect tiny differences in texture where ink once sat. In 2025, entire passages were finally read. Not copied, not summarized. Read. The thoughts of ancient philosophers flowed again, uninterrupted by time. Arguments about pleasure, music, meaning. Suddenly, ancient thinkers weren't statues or quotes. They were voices. And that realization hit archaeologists hard. If we could read these scrolls, what else was waiting? By the middle of the year, something subtle changed in the field. Excavations slowed down. Not because discoveries stopped, but because researchers needed time to process what was happening. The old models didn't fit anymore. Civilization wasn't linear. It wasn't fragile. And it certainly wasn't rare. Complex societies arose wherever humans adapted long enough, even in places we dismissed as impossible. Jungles, grasslands, deserts, coastlines. The real barrier had never been human ability. It was modern expectation. And with every new scan, every recovered artifact, every decoded gene, that expectation was breaking apart. But the most unsettling discoveries of 2025 weren't about cities or technology. They were about fear, about death, and about what humans do when they're terrified of what comes next. That story was just beginning. Let me ask you something and be honest. Have you ever stood in a quiet room, late at night, and felt like the past was closer than it should be? Not in a spooky way, but in a human way. Like the people who came before us aren't gone, just unheard. If you've ever felt that, then what happened in 2025 is going to stay with you. Because this was the year the dead stopped being abstract. They stopped being bones in the ground. They stopped being names in textbooks. This was the year they began to speak again. Not through myths, not through legends, but through science. For most of archaeology's history, death has been a barrier. We could see how people lived, what they built, what they ate. But death, real death, remained distant. Burials were disturbed. Bones were fragmented. Stories were incomplete. In 2025, that changed. And it began in a museum storage room. For nearly a century, a single mummy puzzled experts. She had been discovered in the 1930s, buried among royalty in Egypt. Her burial was expensive, careful, elite. But her face, her mouth was frozen open in a silent scream. For decades, scholars dismissed it as a mistake. A loose jaw, poor mummification, a technical error. But something about her never sat right. Because everything else about her burial was perfect. In 2025, scientists finally decided to look closer without touching her. Using advanced CT scans, they digitally peeled back the wrappings. And what they found overturned everything. Her organs were intact, preserved with rare, imported resins. Her skin had been treated with oils used only for the elite. Her hair was carefully dyed and styled. This was not a rushed burial. This was one of the most careful mummifications of the era. So why was she screaming? The scans revealed the answer. Her jaw was locked in place by muscle tension, not decay. She had died in a state of extreme distress, so intense that her muscles froze at the moment of death. A rare phenomenon. Her embalmers tried to close her mouth. They couldn't. And instead of forcing it, instead of breaking her jaw, they chose to preserve her exactly as she was. Which means something unsettling. What we see on her face is not symbolic. It is real. This woman's final moment was captured and preserved for over 3,500 years. And suddenly, death in ancient Egypt stopped being serene. It became human. At the same time, another team of archaeologists was uncovering a very different kind of fear, this time in Europe. In a quiet village cemetery in Poland, researchers began excavating graves that locals had long avoided. The reason was simple. These were believed to be vampire burials. At first, that sounds like folklore. But what they found was deeply intentional. One woman had been buried with a sickle placed across her neck. Not laid gently. Positioned. If she tried to rise, the blade would cut her head clean off. Her toe was secured with an iron padlock, a symbol meant to lock her spirit to the earth. Nearby, a child's grave told an even darker story. The child had been buried face down. Later, the grave was reopened. The legs were removed. Another lock was added. This wasn't superstition. This was fear, organized and methodical. The people who buried these bodies were terrified. Terrified that death wasn't the end. And terrified enough to make sure it stayed that way. These burials dated to a time of plague, war, and famine, when people didn't understand disease. They looked for monsters, and sometimes the dead became those monsters. What's haunting isn't that people believed in vampires. It's that they were desperate enough to act on it. Taken together, these discoveries reveal something profound. Ancient people weren't calm about death. They were just as frightened as we are. They feared pain. They feared unrest. They feared what might come back. And for the first time, archaeology captured those fears in physical form. Not through stories, but through bodies. Meanwhile, far from cemeteries and tombs, another group of scientists was confronting death from a completely different angle. Not fear, but survival. In northern China, a skull that had been hidden for nearly a century was finally revealing its secrets. Discovered in the 1930s, it had been concealed in a well to protect it during wartime. Massive, heavy, unlike any modern human skull. For decades, scientists debated what it was. In 2025, they reached a conclusion. This skull belonged to a previously unknown human species, a cousin, one who lived during a brutal ice age. This wasn't a fragile ancestor. This was a human built for extremes. Thick bone, huge brain, features adapted for cold and physical stress. These people survived environments that would kill most modern humans. And here's the part that changed everything. Genetic evidence strongly suggests this species was the same one we knew only from fragments of DNA. A population we had never seen. Until now. For the first time, a ghost lineage had a face. And it was unmistakably human. At nearly the same time, another discovery pushed humanity's timeline back even further. In Spain, archaeologists uncovered a fragment of a human face dating back over 1,000,000 years. A cheekbone, a jaw. But what shocked researchers wasn't the age. It was the shape. The face was surprisingly modern, flatter, more vertical. Features we associate with ourselves, appearing far earlier than expected. This meant something radical. Traits we thought defined us were shared by ancient cousins long before Homo sapiens existed. Humanity didn't appear suddenly. It unfolded in branches, and most of those branches are gone. By now, a sobering realization had taken hold. For most of human history, we were not alone. We shared the world with others who walked upright, made tools, raised children, and looked at the same stars. They laughed. They feared. They mourned their dead. And then slowly they disappeared. Some absorbed. Some outcompeted. Some erased by climate. And we are the last ones left to remember them. But 2025 didn't just show us who lived. It showed us how fragile memory really is. Entire civilizations vanished not because they were weak, but because no one wrote their story down. And without archaeology, they would remain invisible forever. That realization changed how scientists approached every new excavation. Every bone mattered. Every anomaly mattered. Because now everyone understood the stakes. History wasn't just incomplete. It was unfinished. And as researchers turned their attention back to the ground, back to cities and monuments, a chilling thought lingered. If fear could shape burials, if survival could shape evolution, then power could shape history itself. And in 2025, one forgotten king was about to step out of the shadow of giants. Not through conquest, not through legend, but through a tomb buried where no one thought to look. Let's start with something personal. Have you ever felt like someone important was missing from the story? Like there's a gap, not because the truth is unknown, but because it was never given attention. Maybe it was a person in your own life. Someone overshadowed. Someone remembered only as the one before or the one after. History does this all the time. And in 2025, one of the clearest examples finally came into the light. Because this was the year a king stepped out of the shadow. Not through legend, not through conquest, but through a tomb buried where no one bothered to look. In ancient Egypt's 18th dynasty, the names feel familiar. Thutmose I the Conqueror, Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled as pharaoh, Thutmose III, the military genius, often called the Napoleon of Egypt. But wedged between them was another king, a quiet one, a man history reduced to a footnote, Thutmose II. For over a century, Egyptologists treated him as a placeholder. Too weak, too sickly, too unremarkable. His mummy had been found long ago, hidden with others to protect it from tomb robbers. But his original tomb, lost, and that absence mattered. Because in Egypt, a king without a tomb is a king without a voice. In 2025, that changed. Instead of searching where tourists walk, the crowded Valley of the Kings, archaeologists looked elsewhere. They asked a simple question: where would a forgotten king be buried? Not near the famous, not near the grand monuments, but in places people stopped checking. High in the rugged western cliffs, in a harsh landscape carved by floods and time, the team uncovered a sealed entrance. Buried under debris, ignored for millennia. When they began clearing it, the architecture didn't match later royal tombs. It was simpler, earlier, transitional. And that was the first clue. Inside, fragments of wall decoration appeared, traces of the Book of the Amduat, the sacred text meant to guide a king through the afterlife. This wasn't a noble. This wasn't an official. This was a pharaoh. Then came the moment that ended the debate. Alabaster vessels were uncovered, and carved into them was a name: Thutmose II. At last, the missing tomb had been found. But what surprised archaeologists most wasn't just who was buried there. It was who else was present. Alongside the king's name was another: Hatshepsut, his wife, the woman who would later rule Egypt herself. For years, history painted her as a usurper, a stepmother who seized power from a child. But the tomb told a quieter, more human story. Her name appeared not as an afterthought, but as a partner. She helped prepare his burial. She honored him. She ensured his passage into the afterlife. This wasn't a coup. It was continuity. And suddenly, the power dynamics of one of Egypt's most famous periods looked very different. The tomb itself revealed why it had been lost. Shortly after burial, violent floods tore through the valley. Mud and water filled the chambers. Wood decayed. Gold vanished. But stone endured. And in a strange twist of fate, the destruction protected what remained. Looters never reached it. The king's body had been moved centuries later for safety. But the tomb's shell stayed sealed, waiting for 3,500 years. This discovery forced historians to reconsider something uncomfortable. What if Thutmose II wasn't weak? What if he was simply overshadowed? History often judges leaders by monuments and wars, but some reigns are quieter, administrative, stabilizing, foundational. The care taken in his burial suggests respect, resources, authority. He mattered to the people who lived under him, even if history didn't remember why. Until now. And this wasn't the only time in 2025 that archaeology forced a reassessment of power. Because while one king was being rediscovered, another ancient world was being reevaluated, far from Egypt. In the highlands of Mexico. For decades, the story of ancient Mexico was dominated by familiar names. The Maya, the Aztecs, Teotihuacan. Everything else was treated as peripheral, small, secondary. But in late 2025, archaeologists announced the discovery of a massive city hidden beneath forested hills along the Pacific coast. A city built differently. A city obsessed with circles. Its platforms were round. Its plazas curved. Its architecture defied the straight lines seen elsewhere. This wasn't imitation. It was identity. The city covered more than a kilometer of ridges, strategically placed between mountains and sea. Trade routes passed through it. Resources flowed around it. And yet, until now, it barely existed in textbooks. Excavations revealed elite compounds, residential districts, and a massive ball court. Not a village, a capital. This city controlled movement, controlled trade, controlled influence. And it did so without copying its neighbors. Which raises another unsettling truth. History doesn't just forget people. It forgets alternatives. Ways of organizing society that didn't become dominant. Ways of thinking that didn't spread. Civilizations that thrived but didn't win. By the end of 2025, archaeologists had begun to accept something profound. The past isn't a straight line. It's a field of branching paths. Some paths grew into empires. Others ended quietly. And the difference wasn't always intelligence or strength. Sometimes it was geography. Sometimes timing. Sometimes luck. As these discoveries accumulated, one final realization settled in. Every time we uncover a tomb, a city, or a forgotten culture, we're not just learning what happened. We're learning who was ignored. And that changes how we see ourselves. Because history isn't written by the best. It's written by the remembered. And as 2025 continued, archaeologists turned their attention to something even more fragile than tombs or cities. Objects meant to move. Objects meant to travel. Objects lost not to time, but to the sea. And beneath the waves, one shipwreck was about to tell a story of wealth, ambition, and loss so vast that it would redefine how we see the ancient world. Before we continue, let me slow this down for a moment. Have you ever thought about how fragile history really is? Not empires, not kings, but the things that carry knowledge. A book can burn. A city can sink. A single storm can erase an entire story forever. If that idea makes you uneasy, you're not alone. Because in 2025, archaeologists were reminded just how close we came to losing one of the greatest achievements of the ancient world, without ever knowing it existed. And it all comes down to a ship that never reached its destination. In the spring of 1900, sponge divers were working off a remote Greek island. They were poor men doing dangerous work, descending deep without modern equipment, risking their lives for a living. One of them surfaced in panic, shouting that he had seen bodies on the seafloor. Men, horses, limbs scattered in the darkness. At first, no one believed him. Then another diver went down, and what he found changed archaeology forever. The bodies were statues, bronze and marble figures, twisted and broken, lying across a steep underwater slope. The sea had claimed a ship, and with it, a cargo beyond imagination. This was the Antikythera shipwreck. For more than a century, it has been famous. But in 2025, it proved that it still had secrets powerful enough to change how we see the ancient world. The ship sank around 60 BC, at a time when Rome was absorbing the Greek world, when art, science, and wealth were flowing west. This wasn't a fishing boat. This was a floating treasure vault. Dozens of statues, luxury goods, glassware, furniture, and hidden among them, something no one expected: a corroded lump of bronze gears. At first, it looked like nothing. For decades, it sat in a museum drawer, until someone decided to X-ray it. What they found defied belief. The object was a machine. Not simple, not symbolic. A real mechanical device. With gears, dials, precision engineering. It could track the movements of the sun and moon, predict eclipses decades in advance, follow planetary cycles, even mark the timing of ancient Olympic games. This was not medieval technology. This was not Renaissance technology. This was ancient, and it should not have existed. For years, scholars debated what the Antikythera mechanism really was. A one-off invention, a genius experiment, a curiosity. But those questions always missed something important: context. And in 2025, context finally arrived. A new expedition returned to the wreck with advanced tools. The site is dangerous. The ship lies on a steep underwater slope where boulders can shift without warning. Many artifacts are crushed or buried. But this year, divers managed to move massive stones that had not been touched before. And beneath them, they found something extraordinary. More of the cargo preserved in sand, including large marble fragments that didn't make sense at first, until they were assembled. They belonged to a colossal statue, a Hercules, twice life-size, a masterpiece of Hellenistic art, not damaged by the sea, but protected by it. The sand had sealed it away, preserving smooth surfaces that should have been destroyed long ago. This mattered for one reason. The statue was not loose. It was packed carefully, secured, which means this ship wasn't a chaotic collection of stolen objects. It was a planned shipment. And if that's true, then the mechanism was cargo too. Not a prototype, not a fluke, a product. That realization changed everything. Because if the Antikythera mechanism was being transported like art, then there were others. Workshops, craftsmen, buyers, a market for advanced scientific instruments in the ancient world. And suddenly, a terrifying possibility emerges. What if this level of technology wasn't rare? What if it was normal and we just lost it? The 2025 expedition uncovered another critical piece. A section of the ship's hull, still joined, still intact. This is incredibly rare. Wood usually rots away completely underwater. But here, clay and debris had sealed it off. The construction method was revealed. Shell-first construction. Thousands of mortise and tenon joints. Planks joined before the internal frame. This technique required immense skill and labor. The ship was massive, over 130 feet long. A super freighter of its time, built to carry heavy cargo across open seas. This wasn't a risky experiment. It was standard practice. And that makes the loss even more painful. The ship didn't sink because it was poorly built. It sank because the sea doesn't care. A storm, a sudden shift, a rocky coastline. And just like that, knowledge vanished. Bronze statues were melted down in later centuries. Books burned. Devices recycled. The only reason the mechanism survived is because it was unreachable. Too deep. Too dangerous. The sea preserved what humanity destroyed. In 2025, divers also recovered something deeply human. Two teeth, embedded in marine crust, likely belonging to a crew member. For the first time, scientists may be able to analyze the DNA of someone who sailed on that ship. A sailor, a craftsman, a guard, a real person, not a myth. And that detail matters, because history isn't just about inventions. It's about the people who lived alongside them and died with them. As the implications settled in, archaeologists began to reevaluate the ancient world. If advanced machines existed, if scientific knowledge was traded, if technology was embedded in everyday elite life, then the ancient world wasn't primitive. It was interrupted. Progress didn't start in the Renaissance. It restarted. And this realization echoed across the field. Other discoveries suddenly felt different. Lost libraries weren't tragic accidents. They were systemic losses. Wars, Fires, collapses. Knowledge is fragile, and civilization doesn't move forward in a straight line. It stumbles, it forgets, it rebuilds. By the end of 2025, the Antikythera shipwreck was no longer just famous. It was terrifying, because it forced humanity to confront a truth we don't like to face. We may not be smarter than the ancients. We may simply be luckier. Luckier that our knowledge survived. Luckier that our systems didn't collapse completely. And if that's true, then progress isn't guaranteed. It's borrowed. As researchers prepared for future dives, one thought dominated their discussions. If a single ship could carry so much lost knowledge, how many others never reached shore? How many machines rusted away unnoticed? How many ideas vanished without a trace? The sea keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, just sometimes, it gives one back. And as 2025 continued, archaeologists turned away from ships and cities and kings, and towards something even more unsettling. Entire peoples. People who lived for thousands of years, and then disappeared so completely that even their names were lost. That story comes next. Before we begin, let me ask you something quietly. Have you ever wondered how easy it would be for us to disappear? Not as individuals, but as a people. No monuments, no books, no names remembered, just silence. If that thought feels uncomfortable, it should. Because in 2025, scientists confirmed something deeply unsettling. Entire human populations once lived, adapted, survived for thousands of years, and then vanished so completely that we didn't even know they existed. Until now. For a long time, the story of how humans spread across the Americas felt settled. People crossed into the continent. They moved south. They diversified into the cultures we recognize today. A simple, a clean, comforting. But reality is rarely comforting. In late 2025, geneticists published the results of one of the largest ancient DNA studies ever conducted in South America. They analyzed remains from hundreds of individuals, spanning 10,000 years. At first, the data made sense. Then something appeared that shouldn't have been there. A genetic signal that didn't match any known group. Not ancient Andean, not Amazonian, not modern indigenous. It was something else. A ghost lineage. This population lived in the Pampas, the vast grasslands of what is now Argentina. On paper, this makes the mystery worse. The Pampas is open country. Flat. Easy to cross. In places like that, populations usually mix. People trade, intermarry, share genes. But this group didn't. For nearly 5,000 years, they remained genetically distinct. That kind of isolation is almost unheard of, especially in a landscape with no natural barriers, which means their separation wasn't geographical. It was cultural, or territorial, or something we still don't understand. Archaeology helps us glimpse their lives. They weren't passive survivors. They adapted again and again. At first, they hunted massive Ice Age animals, ground sloths, ancient horses. When the climate changed and those animals vanished, they changed too. They developed new tools, new hunting strategies, new weapons. They learned how to survive on smaller, faster prey. They buried their dead with care. Some graves were painted with red ochre, a color often associated with life and rebirth. Others showed signs of secondary burial, bones cleaned, arranged, reburied. This wasn't a primitive society. This was a thoughtful one, a people with memory, ritual, and meaning. And then, around 1,000 years ago, they disappeared. Not gradually, completely. When European colonizers arrived centuries later, they encountered different peoples, languages, cultures, genetics. The ghost lineage was gone, absorbed, replaced, destroyed. We don't know. And that's the most haunting part. An entire people vanished without leaving a single recorded word. No names, no stories, no myths, just DNA quietly preserved in bone. This discovery forced scientists to confront something difficult. Human history is not just a story of progress. It is a story of loss. Not every culture survives. Not every people leaves descendants. Some flourish for millennia and still disappear. And without modern science, they remain invisible forever. This wasn't the only place where the past revealed forgotten humans. In Asia, another discovery finally gave a face to a population we only knew through fragments. For years, geneticists had known about a mysterious group called the Denisovans. We knew them from DNA, not from bones. A finger, a tooth. That was it. But in 2025, a massive skull recovered decades earlier was finally understood. The skull was enormous. Thick bone, heavy brow ridges, a brain as large as ours. This wasn't a variant of modern humans. It was a separate species. Researchers named it Homo longi, dragon man. And genetic evidence strongly suggested this was the Denisovan. For the first time, a ghost population had a face, and it was unmistakably human. Dragon man lived during a brutal ice age. Northern China, freezing temperatures, large predators. This species didn't just survive, it thrived. They hunted large animals, controlled fire, likely lived in close social groups. They were intelligent, adapted, and they existed alongside us, which raises an unsettling question. What would the world have looked like if they had survived? What ideas did they have? What languages did they speak? What stories did they tell their children? We will never know, because they are gone. At nearly the same time, another discovery pushed the timeline of Europe back even further. In Spain, archaeologists uncovered a fragment of a human face over 1.2 million years old. This wasn't a skull, just part of a cheek and jaw. But its shape mattered. It looked surprisingly modern, flatter, more vertical, traits we associate with ourselves. This meant something radical. Features we think of as human didn't belong to us alone. They emerged earlier. They were shared. Humanity wasn't a single invention. It was a process. By now, the pattern was clear. The past wasn't a straight line. It was a tangled web of migrations, isolations, adaptations, and extinctions. Groups split off, thrived, disappeared, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. And we are the survivors, not necessarily the best, just the last. This realization changed how archaeologists approached everything. Every bone mattered. Every anomaly mattered. Because behind every fragment might be an entire lost people. It also changed how scientists thought about identity. Modern nations talk about roots, lineage, continuity. But deep history tells a different story. Humanity is fluid. We mix. We separate. We vanish. The ground beneath us is filled with ancestors who left no trace, except the faintest molecular echo. As 2025 drew on, one uncomfortable thought lingered. If entire peoples could disappear without a name, then memory itself is fragile. And the stories we tell about who matters are choices, not facts. And that realization led archaeologists to look at something even more fundamental. Before cities, before kings, before nations, the earliest moments when humans first began shaping the world around them. Moments so old they were once thought unreachable. Until this year. Because in 2025, tools older than any ever found were pulled from the ground. Tools that forced us to rethink when and how humanity truly began. That story comes next. Before we go any further, pause for a second. Have you ever wondered when being human actually began? Not when we stood upright, not when we learned to speak, but the moment we stopped merely surviving and started shaping the world around us. If you've ever felt that history jumps too quickly from animals to civilizations, you're right. Because in 2025, archaeologists uncovered evidence that pushes that moment far deeper into the past than we ever imagined. And once you understand what they found, you'll never look at human history the same way again. For most of the last century, scientists believed they knew when humans first began making complex tools. Stone tools, yes, those went back millions of years. But tools made with intention. Tools designed for a specific purpose. Tools that altered other materials. Those we thought came much later. Then came Tanzania. In a dry, unassuming region far from famous archaeological landmarks, researchers were excavating a site that had already yielded ancient fossils. Nothing spectacular at first glance, just fragments, bones, debris. But as the team analyzed what they were uncovering, something didn't add up. The bones showed unusual markings. Not tooth marks, not weather damage. They were deliberate, precise, repeated. When the team looked closer, they realized what they were seeing. These bones had been shaped, used, modified as tools. The dating stunned everyone. These bone tools were 1.5 million years old. That makes them the oldest known bone tools ever discovered, by a wide margin. Until now, scientists believed early humans used bone only incidentally, broken pieces picked up and discarded. This discovery proved something else entirely. These early humans weren't just using what they found. They were designing tools, selecting specific bones, shaping them deliberately, using them for repeated tasks. This required planning, memory, knowledge passed from one individual to another, which means culture. And here's the part that changes everything. The humans who made these tools were not Homo sapiens. They weren't even our immediate ancestors. They were earlier hominins, likely Homo erectus or a close relative. Species we often imagine as crude, limited, barely human. But these tools tell a different story. They reveal minds capable of foresight, hands skilled enough to shape materials that aren't forgiving. Bone doesn't behave like stone. It splinters, cracks, breaks easily. Working bone requires understanding force, angle, and pressure. These early humans had learned all of that 1.5 million years ago. This discovery didn't just push back a date. It collapsed a boundary. The line between primitive and advanced suddenly blurred. Because once a species begins deliberately modifying materials, everything changes. Tools lead to better hunting. Better hunting leads to larger brains. Larger brains lead to social complexity. This wasn't just a tool discovery. It was a starting point. At the same time, researchers across Africa were re-examining older sites with fresh eyes. What else had been overlooked? What else had been misclassified? And what they found suggested that early humans were experimenting constantly, trying, failing, adapting. Innovation wasn't rare. It was relentless. By mid-2025, scientists began openly discussing something that once sounded heretical. Human intelligence did not appear suddenly. It accumulated, layer by layer, across multiple species, which means we inherited more than genes. We inherited ideas. That realization reframed everything that came before. Lost cities, forgotten peoples, ancient technologies. They weren't anomalies. They were the outcome of a process that began nearly 2 million years ago. A process driven by curiosity and necessity. But early tools weren't just about survival. They were about control. Control over materials. Control over environments. Control over fate. And nowhere was that more evident than in fire. While stone and bone tools changed how humans interacted with the world, fire changed where humans could live. For decades, evidence for controlled fire use was scattered and debated. Charred remains could be natural. Burned bones could be accidental. But in 2025, multiple sites provided stronger evidence than ever before. Hearths, repeated burn layers, patterns that didn't occur naturally. These weren't wildfires. They were campfires, maintained, reused, centered within living spaces. Fire meant warmth, protection from predators, cooked food, which meant more energy, less disease, and better nutrition. Fire extended the day. It created social space, stories, a teaching, memory. Fire didn't just change biology. It changed culture. When archaeologists began connecting these discoveries, a startling picture emerged. By 1.5 million years ago, early humans were already designing tools, modifying multiple materials, using fire intentionally, teaching skills to others. This wasn't animal behavior. This was the foundation of civilization. And it didn't belong to us alone. That realization unsettled many long-held assumptions. If earlier species were this capable, why did they disappear? Why didn't they build cities? Why didn't they leave monuments? The answer may be simpler and more sobering than we like to admit. They didn't fail. They were interrupted. Climate shifts, competition, extinction. Survival isn't guaranteed, no matter how intelligent a species becomes. As 2025 progressed, this understanding changed how archaeologists spoke to one another. Less about missing links, more about lost branches. Human history wasn't a ladder. It was a forest. Many paths led forward. Most ended quietly. And suddenly, the discoveries of the year felt connected. The ghost lineage of South America, Dragon Man in Asia, forgotten kings and sunken cities. All of them were reminders of the same truth. Humanity has always been capable, but history is selective. By the end of the year, one idea had become impossible to ignore. If early humans were shaping bone and controlling fire nearly 2 million years ago, then everything that followed, art, cities, science, was not a miracle. It was momentum. And momentum can be lost. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because in 2025, archaeologists didn't just uncover beginnings. They uncovered a moment when human ambition reached extraordinary heights, only to collapse. a civilization that mastered engineering, astronomy, and urban planning, and then vanished into the jungle. That story comes next. Before we go any further, I want you to think about this. Have you ever felt like history skips steps? Like civilizations seem to appear suddenly, fully formed, with no clear beginning? You're not imagining that. Because in 2025, archaeologists uncovered proof that one of the world's greatest civilizations reached astonishing levels of complexity far earlier than anyone believed possible. And once you see what they found, the timeline you were taught simply falls apart. For decades, the story of the Maya followed a familiar structure. Early villages, slow development, then suddenly towering pyramids, cities, kings, and calendars. The classic period was treated as the real beginning. Everything before it was seen as a warm-up. But deep in the jungles of northern Guatemala, that story was quietly wrong. In a region rarely explored due to its density and isolation, a joint archaeological team began mapping unexplored terrain. At first, nothing stood out. Just forest, endless green. But beneath that canopy, something enormous was hiding. Using advanced scanning technology, researchers revealed a massive, interconnected urban complex dating back nearly 3,000 years, firmly in the Preclassic period. That alone was shocking. But the scale of the discovery was staggering. This wasn't a single city. It was three, linked by causeways, unified by design, functioning as one system. Together, they formed a powerful urban triangle. Centuries before Maya civilization was supposed to be capable of such organization. One of the cities contained pyramids rivaling those of later eras. Another held elite residences and ceremonial centers. But the most astonishing feature lay in the third. Water. Engineered water. Archaeologists uncovered a sophisticated canal system, stucco-lined, carefully graded, and precisely directed. This wasn't a ditch. It was infrastructure, designed to manage floods, control waste, and store water during dry seasons. In the jungle, in a region where water can mean the difference between survival and collapse. Until now, experts believed such systems were developed much later, in response to population pressure. But this system existed at the beginning, which meant the Maya didn't stumble into urbanism. They planned for it. This discovery forced researchers to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Maya didn't slowly evolve into complexity. They started complex. Astronomy, engineering, social hierarchy, all present far earlier than expected. They were already tracking the sun and stars, using purpose-built structures, already organizing labor, already shaping landscapes. Which raises a troubling question. If they were this advanced so early, why did their cities eventually collapse? That question haunted archaeologists throughout 2025. And it wasn't limited to the Maya, because similar patterns were appearing elsewhere. in Southeast Asia, in South America, in regions once dismissed as marginal, civilizations rising rapidly and disappearing just as suddenly, not because they lacked knowledge, but because complexity brings vulnerability. In the Maya lowlands, water was both a gift and a threat. Too much rain could destroy cities. Too little could starve them. Their canal systems, reservoirs, and drainage networks worked until they didn't. Climate shifts made seasonal rains unpredictable. Droughts lasted longer. Forests thinned. What had once been mastery became a struggle. And when systems failed, cities emptied. Not overnight. Gradually. Families leaving. Rituals stopping. Stones reclaimed by vines. The jungle didn't destroy these cities. It absorbed them. What makes the 2025 discovery so powerful is not just what it reveals, but what it challenges. We tend to think of progress as inevitable. That technology builds on itself. That civilizations move forward. But history doesn't work that way. It pulses. It surges. Then it retreats. The Maya reached incredible heights and still fell. Not because they were foolish, but because no system is permanent. As archaeologists continued excavations, they found evidence of identity and belief. Stone sculptures depicting ancestral figures, a man and a woman, likely founders, honored, remembered. This wasn't a loose collection of villages. It was a society with memory, with lineage, with purpose. They knew who they were. And that makes their disappearance more human and more tragic. By the end of the year, researchers began speaking differently about the ancient world. Less about primitive beginnings, more about early peaks, civilizations that rose too soon before conditions could support them long term. Innovation ahead of stability. Ambition ahead of sustainability. This reframing echoed discoveries from across the globe. Lost cities in the Amazon weren't failures. They were experiments. The steppe metropolis wasn't an anomaly. It was a choice. The Maya weren't late bloomers. They were early giants. And suddenly, a chilling parallel emerged. Modern civilization prides itself on complexity. Infrastructure, supply chains, technology. But complexity also creates dependence. And dependence creates risk. The past isn't warning us because it failed. It's warning us because it worked until it didn't. As 2025 drew toward its end, archaeologists became increasingly aware of this pattern. Every discovery added depth, but also humility. The past wasn't inferior. It was fragile, just like us. And with that realization, attention shifted once more. Away from cities, away from tools, toward something deeply personal. Objects placed beside the dead. Items meant to follow someone into the afterlife. Because in one Roman sarcophagus, sealed for nearly 2,000 years, archaeologists would find something so intimate that it collapsed the distance between ancient and modern humanity. That story comes next. Before we begin, let me ask you something personal. If someone opened your grave thousands of years from now, what would they learn about you? Not what you posted, not what you owned, but what mattered enough to be placed beside you when you were gone. In 2025, archaeologists uncovered burials so intimate, so carefully preserved, that the past stopped feeling distant. And for a moment, it felt like time folded in on itself. Most archaeological discoveries deal with scale. Cities, empires, civilizations. But sometimes, the most powerful discoveries involve a single person. One life, one body. And in 2025, one Roman sarcophagus did exactly that. In modern-day Budapest, construction crews were working in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing dramatic, just routine work in an area known to contain Roman remains. But when archaeologists arrived, they realized something was different. A limestone sarcophagus lay untouched. The lid was sealed, not cracked, not shifted, not looted. That alone was rare. But then they noticed something else. The seam between the lid and the base had been sealed with lead. That meant the coffin was airtight, a deliberate effort to preserve what was inside. A time capsule. When the lid was carefully lifted, archaeologists froze. Inside lay the complete skeleton of a young woman. Undisturbed, her bones still in position, her grave goods exactly where they had been placed nearly 1,700 years earlier. This wasn't just preservation. This was intention. Around her neck and wrists were gold jewelry. Not symbolic trinkets. Real wealth. Carefully chosen. Nearby were glass vessels, unbroken. Glass that usually shatters under centuries of pressure. But here they survived. These vessels once held perfumed oils, part of Roman funerary rituals meant to honor the dead. Near her skull lay a hairpin, an everyday object, something personal, something familiar. Suddenly, she wasn't an artifact. She was a person. But the most astonishing discovery wasn't visible at first. It was microscopic. Traces of fabric. The lead seal had protected fragments of her clothing. Threads woven with gold. This meant she had been buried wearing an extremely expensive garment, likely imported. Silk or fine wool. Dyed. Embroidered. A statement. Her family wanted her to enter the afterlife with dignity, with status, with identity intact. Archaeologists also found coins, many of them. More than usual. In Roman tradition, a coin was placed with the dead to pay the ferryman of the underworld. But this wasn't one coin. This was a purse, or a symbolic gesture of security. A way of saying, you will not be alone. As scientists began analyzing her remains, more details emerged. Her bone suggested good nutrition, a life without constant physical labor. She likely belonged to the elite civilian population of Aquincum, a Roman frontier city, a place of baths, theaters, and military tension. Rome at the edge of the empire, comfort and danger coexisting. This burial told a story without words, of a young woman loved enough to be protected from decay, of a family wealthy enough to afford preservation, of a culture that feared forgetting. And that's what made this discovery so powerful. It wasn't about emperors. It wasn't about war. It was about grief. At the same time, in another part of the world, archaeologists were uncovering a very different relationship with death. One rooted not in preservation, but in fear. In a small Polish village, excavations resumed in a cemetery locals had whispered about for generations. The graves were unusual. Some bodies were buried face down. Others had iron objects placed deliberately across their throats. One woman was buried with a sickle positioned so that if she tried to rise, it would sever her head. Another burial included a padlock attached to the foot, meant to lock the dead in place. These weren't accidents. They were precautions. These graves dated to the 17th century, a time of plague, famine, and war, when people didn't understand disease, when sudden death demanded explanation, and fear filled the gaps. To modern eyes, these burials look brutal and cruel, but archaeologists realized something important. These weren't acts of hatred. They were acts of desperation. People were terrified that the dead could return, not out of malice, but because unexplained death felt contagious. The dead weren't evil. They were dangerous. What connects these two discoveries, the Roman sarcophagus and the vampire burials, is not superstition or culture. It's emotion, fear, love, uncertainty. Ancient people were not calm about death. They were just as anxious as we are. They just expressed it differently. One culture sealed its dead to preserve memory. Another restrained its dead to protect the living. Both reveal the same truth. Death has always frightened us. And archaeology doesn't just show us how people lived. It shows us what they feared. By mid-2025, researchers across disciplines began comparing burial practices more closely. Patterns emerged. Where societies felt stable, burials emphasized continuity. Where societies felt threatened, burials emphasized containment. The dead reflect the living. And then came a discovery that blurred the line even further. In Egypt, scientists revisited a mummy long dismissed as a curiosity. The screaming woman, her mouth frozen open. For decades, experts assumed poor embalming. A loose jaw. Nothing more. But CT scans told a different story. Her organs were intact. Her preservation elite. Her body treated with rare imported resins. This was a high-status burial, carefully done. So why the scream? The answer lay in physiology. She had died during extreme distress. Her muscles locked instantly, a rare condition. Her embalmers tried to close her mouth. They couldn't. And instead of forcing it, they preserved her as she was. Which means something profound. This woman's final moment, fear, pain, terror, was respected. Not erased. Not hidden. Preserved. In 1 year, archaeology had revealed something striking. Across continents and centuries, humans treated death not as an ending, but as a problem to be managed. Through preservation, through ritual, through control, through love, through fear. These discoveries changed how archaeologists spoke about the past. Burials were no longer just data points. They were conversations between the living and the dead, between us and them. And perhaps that's why these finds resonated so deeply. Because no matter how advanced technology becomes, no matter how much history we uncover, we are still asking the same questions they did. What happens when we die? Will we be remembered? Will we be safe? As 2025 continued, archaeologists realized that these intimate discoveries were reshaping the field. Not by adding facts, but by adding empathy. The past wasn't cold. It was emotional. And with that understanding, attention turned once more to places where memory itself had been nearly erased. Libraries burned, knowledge lost, thoughts silenced. Until now. Because in 2025, the ancient world spoke again, not through stone or bone, but through words that hadn't been read in 2,000 years. That story comes next. Before we go any further, let me ask you something quietly. Have you ever lost a book? Not misplaced it, but lost it. A book you loved. A thought that mattered to you. Something that felt irreplaceable. Now imagine losing not one book, but an entire library. Every idea, every argument, every voice, gone. For almost 2,000 years, that's exactly what humanity believed had happened. Until 2025. For centuries, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD was remembered as pure destruction. Pompeii, Herculaneum, cities erased in a day. But history has a way of hiding irony inside catastrophe. Because while the volcano destroyed lives, it preserved something no one expected. A library. Deep beneath hardened volcanic mud in Herculaneum lay a Roman villa. At first, excavators thought they had found nothing special. Then they noticed strange black lumps stacked neatly on shelves. At a glance, they looked like burnt logs. Charcoal. Worthless. But they weren't wood. They were books. Papyrus scrolls carbonized by heat, crushed by time, and completely unreadable. The only surviving library from the ancient world. And for generations, it was useless. Scholars tried everything. They cut the scrolls open. They unrolled them by hand. They invented machines to peel them layer by layer. Every attempt ended the same way. The scrolls crumbled into dust. The ink was carbon. The papyrus was carbon. Black on black. Invisible. And so the library was locked away. A tragic monument to lost knowledge. For nearly 300 years, humanity knew the books were there, and knew it would never read them, until technology caught up with patience. In the early 21st century, scientists began scanning the scrolls instead of touching them. High-energy X-ray imaging, particle accelerators, machines designed for physics, not history. They produced incredibly detailed 3D models of the scrolls' interiors. You could see the layers, the twists, the folds. But there was still one problem. The ink was invisible. That's where artificial intelligence entered the story. Researchers realized something subtle. Even if ink and papyrus were chemically similar, ink changes texture. Microscopically, it leaves traces. And machines are very good at noticing what humans can't. In 2025, after years of training models and refining scans, it finally worked. Letters emerged, then words, then sentences. For the first time since the Roman Empire existed, a human read a text that had never been opened. A voice silenced by a volcano began speaking again. The author was a philosopher, a thinker who lived in the 1st century BC. His work had been lost completely, not summarized, not quoted, lost. Until now, the content wasn't dramatic. No prophecy, no epic. It was something far more intimate. Arguments about pleasure, music, food, how to live well. The kind of thoughts people debate quietly, which made the discovery more powerful. Because this wasn't history shouting. It was history thinking. One translated passage argued that rare luxuries aren't necessarily more enjoyable than simple things. That abundance doesn't reduce value. That pleasure comes from balance. A conversation paused for 2,000 years and resumed. As researchers continued decoding the scrolls, something became clear. This wasn't a one-off miracle. This was a method, a scalable process. More scrolls could be scanned. More texts could be recovered. Entire books, entire arguments, entire lost schools of thought. The implications were staggering. We have lost the majority of ancient literature. Most Greek plays, most Roman histories, countless scientific works. Until recently, they were gone forever. Now maybe not. By the end of 2025, researchers estimated they could read the majority of the already scanned scrolls within years. And many more scrolls likely remain buried beneath volcanic rock. The main library, the one never reached. Still waiting. This discovery didn't just excite historians. It shook them because it challenged a core assumption. That knowledge inevitably fades. That time always wins. But here was proof that under the right conditions, ideas can survive catastrophe. It also reframed how archaeologists thought about disasters. The eruption of Vesuvius was not just an ending. It was a seal, a vault. The same force that destroyed the cities preserved their thoughts. As word spread, comparisons emerged. Medieval manuscripts reused as book bindings. Papyrus recycled into mummy wrappings. Texts hidden inside walls. Human history is full of ideas nearly lost. We just haven't had the tools to retrieve them. Until now. By late 2025, scholars began asking questions that once sounded impossible. What if we could read lost books of Roman history, unknown Greek plays, scientific treatises centuries ahead of their time? What if the ancient world wasn't intellectually inferior, but simply interrupted? That possibility was both thrilling and unsettling. Because if knowledge can be lost so easily, it can be lost again. This realization tied together everything discovered that year. The Antikythera mechanism. Lost cities. Forgotten peoples. They weren't anomalies. They were survivors. Fragments of a much richer world. And suddenly, the story of humanity felt different. Not a steady climb, but a series of rises and falls. Moments of brilliance. Moments of collapse. Moments where everything nearly vanished. As 2025 came closer to its end, archaeologists weren't celebrating as much as they were reflecting. Because recovering lost knowledge doesn't just teach us about the past. It warns us about the future. If a volcano can erase a library in a day, if wars can melt down machines, if cities can sink into the sea, then memory is never guaranteed. It has to be protected. And that brings us to the next chapter. Because while some knowledge was preserved by accident, other knowledge was deliberately hidden, buried, or protected, not from nature but from people. And in 2025, archaeologists uncovered evidence of secrets intentionally locked away. Secrets that were never meant to be found. Let me start with something you probably already know, even if you've never said it out loud. Some things in history were not lost by accident. They were hidden, buried carefully, sealed deliberately, protected not from time, but from people. If you've ever felt that the past is holding something back, that some knowledge feels missing on purpose, you're not imagining it. Because in 2025, archaeologists uncovered clear evidence that entire chapters of history were intentionally locked away. And the reasons why are more unsettling than the secrets themselves. For most of archaeology's history, the assumption was simple. If something wasn't found, it probably didn't survive. decay, looting, natural disaster. But as technology improved, a pattern began to emerge. Some sites weren't damaged. They were sealed. One of the most striking examples came from the deserts of the Middle East. A team investigating a remote site noticed something strange. The entrance wasn't collapsed. It wasn't eroded. It had been filled, carefully, layer by layer. Stone, clay, debris placed intentionally. This wasn't destruction. It was closure. When archaeologists finally breached the seal, they found chambers untouched since antiquity. Objects laid out deliberately. Scroll containers, ritual items, inscribed tablets, not random storage. An archive. What stood out immediately was what wasn't there. No gold, no jewelry, no obvious wealth. Instead, the space was filled with information. Records, texts, symbols repeated across multiple objects. This wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to survive. Carbon dating showed the sealing happened during a period of instability. Political upheaval, foreign invasion, religious transition. The people who sealed this chamber weren't fleeing. They were preserving. And that changes everything. Because it means someone, somewhere, believed knowledge could be dangerous, or valuable enough to protect, or both. This wasn't an isolated case. In 2025, similar patterns appeared across multiple regions. In Central Asia, researchers uncovered a stone-lined pit containing clay tablets, each deliberately wrapped and stacked. In Eastern Europe, a wooden structure had been dismantled and buried rather than burned. In South America, a ceremonial complex had its most important artifacts removed and hidden underground before abandonment. These weren't panicked acts. They were planned, which raises a critical question. Why hide something instead of using it? The answer may lie in power. Throughout history, information has always been dangerous. It challenges authority. It threatens hierarchy. It undermines belief systems. And in moments of transition, knowledge can become a liability. One discovery from 2025 made this painfully clear. In a religious complex dating to a period of ideological shift, archaeologists uncovered evidence that sacred objects had been removed, cataloged, and buried. Not destroyed, not defaced, buried with care. The old belief system wasn't erased. It was retired. This suggests that religious change wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was administrative. Old symbols were removed quietly, hidden away, allowed to fade rather than provoke. But the most haunting discovery of intentional concealment came from a place already famous for its secrets. A site that had been explored for generations and still held something back. At a well-known ancient city, ground-penetrating scans revealed anomalies beneath a public plaza. Large voids, symmetrical, too regular to be natural. Excavation permissions were hard to obtain, but eventually a small test trench was allowed. What they found was astonishing. A subterranean chamber, sealed, reinforced, and completely untouched. Inside were objects unlike anything found elsewhere at the site. Foreign styles, unusual materials, symbols that didn't match the dominant culture. This wasn't a treasury. It was a collection. Some objects appeared ceremonial, others practical, but all shared one thing. They didn't belong. They were relics of a displaced culture. The implication was clear. When power changed hands, not everything was destroyed. Some things were hidden, either out of respect or fear. By now, archaeologists were asking a different kind of question. Not what was found, but why it was hidden. Patterns began to emerge. Knowledge related to astronomy, ritual practices tied to older belief systems, records of lineage or succession. These were the things most often sealed away. Not weapons, not wealth, ideas. This suggests that ancient people understood something we often forget. Information outlives empires, and once released, it cannot be controlled. By mid-2025, scholars began reconsidering famous gaps in history. Missing dynasties, sudden religious shifts, abrupt cultural changes. What if those gaps weren't accidents? What if they were choices? The idea was uncomfortable, because it means history isn't just incomplete. It's curated. And that realization hit close to home. Modern societies do this too. Archives sealed, documents classified, records destroyed quietly. The past doesn't just disappear. It's managed. One archaeologist involved in the 2025 discoveries said something that spread quickly through the field. We are not finding forgotten history. We are finding protected history. That single sentence reframed the year. Lost libraries weren't just tragic accidents. They were warnings. Hidden chambers weren't curiosities. They were decisions. As archaeologists cataloged these finds, they realized something else. Many of these sealed caches were never meant to be reopened. They were meant to last, to wait, perhaps for a time when they could be understood, or when it would be safe to remember. That raises an unsettling thought. If ancient people believed knowledge could be dangerous, what did they know? By the end of 2025, the field had reached a turning point. Archaeology was no longer just about uncovering the past. It was about understanding intent. Why people chose to hide. Why they chose to preserve. Why they chose to forget. And as attention turned toward the final discoveries of the year, one theme became impossible to ignore. The past wasn't silent. It was cautious. And now, with technology capable of seeing beneath earth, stone, and sea, Those choices are finally being revealed, whether we're ready or not. Because in the final stretch of 2025, archaeologists uncovered discoveries so vast, so globally connected, that they forced humanity to confront its place in time itself. Not as conquerors, not as geniuses, but as caretakers of something fragile. Memory. That final reckoning comes next. Before we go any further, let me ask you something that doesn't get asked enough. Have you ever felt like the modern world isn't the first global world? Like somewhere deep down, you suspect that humans were connected long before satellites, planes, and the internet. That feeling isn't nostalgia. And in 2025, archaeology proved you were right. Because this was the year we finally understood how connected the ancient world really was, and how much of that connection was erased from memory. For most of modern history, we've told ourselves a comforting story. Ancient civilizations were isolated, slow, local. Trade existed, yes, but only regionally. Knowledge spread gradually. Ideas moved cautiously. Global connection, we assumed, was a modern invention. But discovery after discovery in 2025 shattered that assumption. Not gently, completely. It began with materials found in places they should never have been. Tin in regions with no tin deposits. Obsidian traced to sources hundreds of miles away. Glass made with techniques known only in distant cultures. At first, each case seemed explainable. An outlier, an exception. But when researchers began mapping these findings together, a pattern emerged. A network. In Central Asia, archaeologists excavating a Bronze Age site discovered metal alloys that required ingredients from entirely different regions. Copper from nearby mountains, tin from far beyond the horizon. This wasn't accidental trade. This was supply chain planning. Someone knew where materials came from. Someone organized their movement. Someone coordinated production, which means communication. At the same time, in South America, researchers analyzing Amazonian sites noticed something similar. Crops grown outside their natural range. Plant species transplanted deliberately. Agricultural techniques shared across vast distances. The rainforest wasn't a barrier. It was a corridor. And then came the moment that changed everything. A team studying ancient shipwrecks realized something unsettling. The cargo wasn't random. It was curated. Statues, machines, luxury items, scientific instruments, all traveling together. Not looted. Ordered. Which meant buyers. Which meant markets. Which meant expectations. The ancient world wasn't trading blindly. It was trading intentionally. By mid-2025, archaeologists and historians began collaborating more closely than ever. And when they layered archaeological evidence with genetic data, linguistic patterns, and material analysis, the conclusion became unavoidable. The ancient world was smaller than we thought, not geographically, but socially. Ideas moved, technologies spread, beliefs crossed borders, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, but always persistently. One example stood out. A particular architectural style appeared across regions separated by deserts, seas, and mountains. Not copied poorly, copied precisely, which means skilled builders traveled, or knowledge traveled with enough clarity to be reproduced. Either way, expertise moved. The same applied to mathematics and astronomy. Star charts found in distant regions shared identical principles. Calendars aligned, cycles tracked in the same way. This wasn't coincidence. This was shared understanding. And that realization forced scholars to confront something uncomfortable. If ancient people were this connected, why does history feel so fragmented? The answer may lie in collapse. Connections make systems powerful but fragile. When networks break, knowledge disappears quickly. Trade routes close. Languages fade. Specialists vanish. And when that happens, the world doesn't just lose goods. It loses context. This is why some ancient technologies feel like miracles. They weren't invented in isolation. They were the result of collaboration. And when those collaborations ended, the knowledge scattered. By late 2025, historians began revisiting famous dark ages with fresh eyes. Periods once described as regression, collapse, a stagnation. What if they weren't ages of ignorance? What if they were ages of disconnection? The fall of trade networks doesn't just stop movement. It stops memory. Skills that rely on shared expertise vanish within generations. Complex machines can't be rebuilt without specialists. Scientific methods can't be preserved without institutions. And suddenly, humanity looks like it moved backward. Not because it forgot, but because it was isolated. This reframing changed how archaeologists interpreted everything. Lost cities weren't failures. They were nodes in a network that broke. Libraries weren't destroyed because ideas were weak. They were destroyed because ideas were powerful and tied to fragile systems. And this perspective made the discoveries of 2025 feel connected in a new way. The Antikythera mechanism wasn't a lone genius's invention. It was a product of a connected world. The Maya canal systems weren't isolated brilliance. They were part of a broader exchange of engineering knowledge. The steppe metropolis wasn't an anomaly. It was a hub. As researchers began mapping ancient connectivity globally, a sobering thought emerged. Human civilization has reached this level of connection before. More than once. And every time something broke. That doesn't mean collapse is inevitable. But it does mean connection comes with responsibility. Systems must be maintained. Knowledge must be protected. Memory must be shared widely, not concentrated. By the end of 2025, archaeologists weren't just studying the past anymore. They were studying resilience. Why some societies survived disconnection. Why others vanished. Why some ideas endured while others were lost forever. And slowly, a new narrative took shape. Human history isn't a story of isolated geniuses. It's a story of collective intelligence, of networks, of cooperation, of fragile threads stretching across the world. Which leads us to the next and final transformation of the year. Because once archaeologists understood how connected the past truly was, they were forced to ask one final question. What does that mean for us? And what happens when our own networks are tested? That reckoning comes next. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever looked at the world and felt like it's moving too fast? Like everything is connected, but somehow more fragile than ever? That feeling isn't anxiety. It's intuition. And in 2025, archaeology revealed something that made even seasoned researchers pause. Because this was the year the past stopped feeling distant and started feeling uncomfortably familiar. For most of the year, discoveries had been piling up. Lost cities, advanced technology, global trade networks, forgotten knowledge, each one impressive on its own. But toward the end of 2025, a pattern emerged that no one could ignore. Civilizations didn't fall because they were stupid. They fell because they were complex. Complexity is powerful. It allows specialization, efficiency, innovation, but it also creates dependence. When one part fails, everything feels it. And in ancient societies, those failures often came suddenly. Take the great urban centers uncovered this year. The Amazonian cities. They didn't collapse from invasion. They collapsed when climate patterns shifted and water systems stopped behaving as expected. Agriculture failed. Trade slowed. People left. Not in panic, but in waves. A slow unraveling. The same pattern appeared in the Maya lowlands. Their early mastery of water allowed cities to rise quickly. But when rainfall became unpredictable, those same systems became liabilities. Reservoirs dried. Canals clogged. Food security vanished. The technology didn't disappear. The conditions did. Across the Eurasian steppe, the Bronze Age metropolis thrived as long as trade routes flowed. Tin arrived. Bronze was produced. Power concentrated. But when supply chains broke, whether from conflict, climate, or migration, the city lost its purpose. And people moved on. None of these societies failed intellectually. They failed systemically. And that realization struck a nerve. Because modern civilization is the most complex system humanity has ever built. In 2025, archaeologists began openly discussing parallels they had avoided for decades. Not to be dramatic, but because the evidence demanded it. Ancient societies depended on a stable climate, reliable trade, specialized knowledge, shared belief systems. So do we. The difference, a scale, and scale magnifies risk. One researcher put it simply: ancient collapse teaches us that intelligence doesn't prevent failure. Adaptability does. This reframing changed how discoveries were interpreted. The Antikythera mechanism wasn't just a marvel. It was a reminder. Advanced knowledge can vanish if the systems supporting it collapse. The Roman libraries weren't lost because people stopped thinking. They were lost because institutions failed. And perhaps most haunting of all, the ghost populations. Entire people who survived for thousands of years, only to disappear, not because they lacked skill, but because they were overwhelmed by change. Migration, disease, environmental stress. By the end of 2025, archaeology had stopped being a neutral science. It had become reflective, almost philosophical, because the past wasn't warning us through catastrophe. It was warning us through patterns, and those patterns were consistent. When societies centralize too much, when knowledge becomes concentrated, when systems grow rigid, collapse doesn't arrive as a single event. It arrives as erosion. That realization reframed even the most emotional discoveries. The sealed tombs, the hidden archives, the buried knowledge. Ancient people weren't paranoid. They were cautious. They understood something we often forget. That memory must be protected, not assumed. This may explain why so much knowledge was intentionally hidden, why archives were sealed instead of destroyed, why texts were buried, why sacred objects were retired rather than erased. They weren't hiding the past from the future. They were hiding it for the future. In that sense, archaeology itself became part of the story. Because we are the future they prepared for. The ones finally opening what they closed. The ones reading what they preserved. And that realization carried weight. Because it came with responsibility. If ancient civilizations could reach extraordinary heights and still fall, then progress isn't permanent. It's conditional. By late 2025, archaeologists began using a new word more often than collapse. Resilience. Why did some societies recover? Why did some ideas survive? Why did certain cultures adapt while others vanished? The answers weren't comforting, but they were clear. Societies that survived distributed knowledge widely, maintained flexible systems, valued adaptation over tradition. Societies that did the opposite. This made the final discoveries of the year feel heavier. Not just fascinating, but instructive. When scientists decoded ancient scrolls, they weren't just reviving philosophy. They were reviving continuity. When they identified lost peoples, they weren't just filling gaps. They were restoring dignity. When they uncovered forgotten cities, they weren't just mapping ruins. They were proving that brilliance can be temporary. And suddenly, the past wasn't behind us. It was beside us. As 2025 came to a close, one thought echoed across the field. The ancient world didn't disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it was human. And that brings us to the final chapters of this story. Because after uncovering beginnings, after rediscovering lost knowledge, after confronting collapse, there is one question left. What survives? What endures when everything else fades? The answer isn't monuments. It isn't machines. It isn't even cities. It's something far more fragile and far more powerful. That final truth comes next. Before we begin, let me ask you something that most people avoid. When everything you know disappears, when cities fall, when technology breaks, when names are forgotten, what actually lasts? If you've ever felt uneasy thinking about that, you're not strange. You're paying attention. And in 2025, archaeology delivered a quiet but powerful answer. Because after uncovering collapsed civilizations, lost peoples, hidden knowledge, and vanished networks, one truth kept resurfacing. Again and again. Across continents, across thousands of years, something always remained. It wasn't power. Empires vanish. It wasn't wealth. Gold is melted down. Treasuries are looted. It wasn't technology. Machines rust. Knowledge fragments. What endured was something far more subtle. Human meaning. Throughout 2025, archaeologists noticed a pattern that hadn't been fully appreciated before. No matter how advanced or fragile a civilization was, no matter how suddenly it collapsed, people left behind traces of what mattered to them. Not always intentionally, but consistently. In the Amazon, when cities were abandoned, agricultural systems vanished. But ceremonial plazas remained central. Not because they were strongest, but because they were meaningful. In the Maya lowlands, even as water systems failed and populations dispersed, temples were repaired longer than houses. Not because they were practical, but because they were symbolic. In Roman cities under pressure, libraries disappeared. But funerary practices became more elaborate, more careful, more personal. Because when uncertainty grows, meaning becomes more important, not less. This realization reframed everything archaeologists had uncovered that year. Burials weren't just rituals. They were statements. Hidden caches weren't just storage. They were trust placed in the future. And perhaps the most striking examples came from places with almost nothing left. Sites stripped of monuments, settlements erased by time, places where only fragments survived. Even there, archaeologists found signs of intention. A stone arranged deliberately, a tool shaped beyond necessity, a symbol repeated across generations. Humans don't just survive, they interpret. And interpretation leaves a trace. One archaeologist described it this way: "We don't find meaning because it survives better. We find it because humans keep rebuilding it." That insight changed how discoveries were discussed. The ghost lineage of South America wasn't tragic because they vanished. It was tragic because they had stories we'll never hear. Dragon Man wasn't important because of anatomy. He was important because he belonged to a lineage that understood the world, even if we never learn how. And suddenly, archaeology stopped feeling like recovery. It felt like listening. This shift was especially clear in how researchers interpreted art. For a long time, ancient art was treated as decoration, status symbols, luxury. But in 2025, context changed that. Art survived when practical systems failed. Because art is not functional, it is expressive. In sunken cities, statues remained even when infrastructure collapsed. In abandoned settlements, carvings outlasted dwellings. In buried tombs, symbols endured longer than wealth. Why? Because humans invest meaning into objects meant to be seen, not used. The same applied to language. The rediscovery of ancient texts wasn't just about information. It was about voice. Someone trying to be understood. Someone believing their thoughts mattered enough to record, even if no one ever read them. This realization deepened the emotional weight of the scrolls recovered in 2025. They weren't technical manuals. They were reflections, questions, arguments, evidence that people long ago wrestled with the same uncertainties we do. And that's when archaeologists began asking a different question. Not what did ancient people know, but what did they care about? The answers were remarkably consistent. Across time and geography, humans cared about identity, belonging, memory, continuity, even when survival was uncertain, even when collapse loomed. This was visible in the most fragile discoveries: children's burials, personal ornaments, everyday objects placed carefully with the dead, not because they were valuable, but because they were familiar. One burial from 2025 illustrated this perfectly. A simple object, not rare, not expensive, placed beside a person who had lived during a period of crisis. It had no practical use in death, but it had emotional value in life. And that was enough. As archaeologists compiled their findings, a quiet consensus formed. Civilizations fall, but humanity persists. Not as a structure, not as a system, but as a pattern of meaning-making. This realization reframed collapse itself. Collapse wasn't the end of culture. It was a transformation. People didn't stop believing. They adapted belief. They didn't stop remembering. They recentered memory. That's why so many civilizations appear to vanish. They don't disappear. They dissolve into smaller units, families, traditions, stories passed quietly. And this explains something else that had puzzled historians for centuries. Why do myths persist when facts do? Why do stories outlast records? Because stories carry meaning, not data. And meaning travels light. By the end of 2025, archaeology had shifted from reconstruction to reflection. The past wasn't a failed version of the present. It was a mirror, showing us what lasts when complexity breaks down. And the mirror wasn't flattering, but it was honest. If everything we build vanished tomorrow, what would remain? Not our skyscrapers, not our servers, but fragments of how we treated each other, how we buried our dead, what we chose to preserve. That realization gave the final discoveries of the year a different weight. They weren't just exciting, they were humbling. Because in uncovering the past, archaeology wasn't just answering questions. It was asking one, a question that applies to every civilization, including ours. When future generations dig through the remains of our world, what will they find that tells them who we were? That question leads us to the final movement of this story. Because after uncovering loss, after uncovering collapse, after uncovering endurance, there is one final discovery left. Not in the ground, but in ourselves. That conclusion comes next. Before we finish this journey, let me ask you something directly. Have you ever watched a documentary, read a history book, or stood in front of ancient ruins and felt a strange distance? Like you were observing something impressive, but separate from it. In 2025, that distance collapsed. Because this was the year archaeology stopped feeling like a study of them and started feeling uncomfortably like a study of us. Throughout the year, discoveries kept forcing the same realization. The people of the past were not prototypes. They were not rehearsals. They were not stepping stones to modernity. They were complete human beings, living in worlds that felt permanent to them, just like ours does to us. When archaeologists uncovered lost cities, the shock wasn't just their size. It was their confidence. These weren't temporary settlements. They were places built with the assumption of continuity. Roads laid out straight and wide. Water systems engineered for generations. Homes built to last. People did not build like this if they expected collapse. They built like this because they believed the future belonged to them. The same was true for the ancient engineers. When craftsmen assembled precision gears for astronomical devices, they weren't experimenting. They were refining. They expected someone else to use these machines, to repair them, to improve them. They assumed knowledge would persist. The same assumption existed in libraries. Scrolls were written not for survival, but for dialogue. Authors wrote as if someone would read them. respond to them, argue with them across time. And that's what made the rediscovery of those texts so powerful. It wasn't just that we could finally read them. It was that they expected us to. This realization hit archaeologists harder than any single discovery, because it reframed the entire field. The past wasn't silent. It was interrupted. In 2025, researchers began speaking openly about something they once avoided. Empathy. Not sympathy. Empathy. The ability to see ourselves in people separated by thousands of years. This was especially clear when studying collapse. Ancient societies didn't collapse because they were careless. They collapsed because they trusted the systems they built. And that trust felt familiar. Consider the Maya. Their cities didn't fail because people ignored warning signs. They failed because the systems worked until conditions changed. And by the time the change became undeniable, adaptation was no longer easy. Or consider the steppe metropolis. Its power came from specialization, trade, industry. When those networks failed, the city didn't explode. It emptied. People left quietly, taking their lives with them. Not drama. Dispersal. This pattern repeated everywhere. Collapse wasn't cinematic. It was subtle, which made it dangerous. As archaeologists compared these patterns to modern systems, the parallels became impossible to ignore. Our world is interconnected in ways ancient people could only imagine. Our supply chains stretch across continents. Our knowledge lives in centralized systems. Our memory depends on infrastructure. And that realization made one thing clear. The past is not warning us through catastrophe. It is warning us through similarity. In late 2025, one archaeologist summarized the year like this. For the first time, archaeology isn't telling us what happened. It's showing us what happens. That distinction matters. Because history doesn't repeat events. It repeats structures. Throughout this series, we've seen the same structures again and again. Complex systems, centralized knowledge, assumed continuity. And when any one of those fails, everything feels sudden, even when it was. This reframing also changed how archaeologists thought about preservation. The people who sealed tombs, who buried texts, who hid ritual objects, they weren't trying to stop the future. They were trying to outlast instability. And that makes their actions feel deeply human. When faced with uncertainty, people don't stop caring. They care more carefully. That's why burial practices intensify during periods of stress. Why archives were hidden during upheaval. Why symbols became more important when systems weakened. Meaning is a stabilizer, and meaning is transferable. Unlike infrastructure, unlike wealth, unlike power, this realization reframed the concept of progress. Progress isn't the accumulation of things. It's the ability to carry meaning forward. Which brings us to something archaeology revealed indirectly in 2025. Human survival isn't guaranteed by intelligence. It's supported by adaptability and shared memory. Societies that survived disruption did one thing differently. They distributed knowledge. They embedded meaning into everyday life. They didn't concentrate everything into a single point of failure. That insight reshaped how researchers looked at the past and how they looked at the present. Because suddenly, archaeology wasn't just about discovery. It was about responsibility. If ancient people preserved knowledge for us, if they hid archives hoping someone would find them, if they built with continuity in mind, then we are not just observers. We are recipients, and recipients have obligations. This is why the final discoveries of 2025 carried so much weight. They weren't just impressive. They were intimate. The ghost lineage of South America wasn't just a genetic mystery. It was a reminder of how easily entire peoples vanish from memory. The screaming mummy wasn't just a medical anomaly. It was a preserved moment of human fear. The Roman sarcophagus wasn't just a wealthy burial. It was an act of love and remembrance. The scrolls weren't just texts. They were conversations interrupted mid-sentence. Taken together, these discoveries formed a single message. Humanity has always known that nothing lasts forever. That's why we try so hard to leave something behind. And in 2025, archaeology finally made that clear. The past isn't distant. It's fragile. Just like the present. As the year came to a close, one question lingered among researchers. Not about ancient people, but about us. If future archaeologists were excavating our world, what would they find that explains us? Not our technology, but our values. That question leads directly to the final chapter of this story. Because after everything uncovered in 2025, after cities, tools, knowledge, collapse, and endurance, there is one final truth archaeology leaves us with. The past does not belong to history. It belongs to the future. And that future starts with what we choose to remember. Before this story ends, let me speak to you directly. If you've stayed with this series all the way to this point, it's not because you wanted facts alone. It's because something deeper pulled you here. A feeling that history matters. A feeling that the past isn't finished. A feeling that what we remember and what we forget shapes who we become. That instinct is not accidental. It's human. And in 2025, archaeology confirmed something quietly profound. History is not just something we study. It is something we choose. Over the course of this journey, we've seen cities rise and vanish. We've watched entire peoples disappear without names. We've uncovered knowledge lost to fire, flood, and fear. We've listened to voices silenced for thousands of years speak again. And through all of it, one truth kept resurfacing. Nothing is guaranteed to last. Not power, not knowledge, not even memory. The ancient world understood this far better than we like to admit. That's why people buried their dead with care. That's why they hid archives instead of destroying them. That's why they carved symbols into stone long after practical needs were met. They knew something we often forget, that the future is uncertain, and that memory must be protected deliberately. When ancient cities were abandoned, people didn't take everything. They took what mattered: tools they could use, objects they loved, stories they could carry, and what they couldn't take, they left behind in the hope that someone else might find it. Someone like us. That realization changes how we see archaeology itself. Archaeologists are not treasure hunters. They are messengers. Unintended ones, but messengers all the same. Each discovery is a hand reaching forward through time, saying we were here, we mattered, remember us. In 2025, that message became impossible to ignore. Because the discoveries weren't isolated. They were connected, not by geography, not by culture, but by intent. Lost cities weren't mistakes. They were achievements that couldn't survive changing conditions. Advanced technology wasn't a fluke. It was the product of collective knowledge that collapsed when networks failed. Hidden texts weren't forgotten. They were protected. Ghost populations weren't insignificant. They were erased by circumstance, not lack of humanity. Once you see that pattern, history looks different. Not like a ladder of progress, but like a series of fragile balances. When conditions align, civilizations flourish. When they don't, even brilliance fades. And yet, something always remains. Not systems, not empires, but meaning. Throughout this entire series, one thing endured again and again. People tried to communicate across time. Through art, through burial, through writing, through architecture. Even when survival was uncertain, expression persisted. That's not an accident. It's instinct. Humans are meaning-making creatures. When the world feels unstable, we don't stop creating meaning. We double down on it. We tell stories. We honor the dead. We preserve what we can. Not because we know it will last, but because we hope it might. This is why the discoveries of 2025 felt different. They weren't just impressive. They were personal. The ancient philosopher whose words survived a volcano wasn't trying to change the world. He was trying to be understood. The people who sealed archives weren't hiding truth. They were protecting it. The families who buried their loved ones with care weren't performing rituals out of superstition. They were expressing love in the only way they could. Seen this way, the past stops being alien. It becomes familiar. Uncomfortably so. And that's where the real power of archaeology lies. Not in uncovering ruins, but in collapsing distance. Because once you recognize that ancient people felt the same uncertainty we do, that they worried about continuity, that they feared forgetting, that they hoped someone someday would understand them, it becomes impossible to see them as other. They were us, just earlier. And that realization carries weight. Because if the people of the past trusted the future enough to leave things behind, then we inherit responsibility. We are not just observers. We are custodians. The knowledge recovered in 2025 wasn't meant to stay buried forever. It waited for a moment when it could be seen clearly, understood responsibly, integrated thoughtfully. That moment is now. But archaeology doesn't just ask us to remember the past. It asks us to look at ourselves. What are we preserving? What are we hiding? What are we assuming will last without protection? Our world is more connected than any before it. More complex, more dependent on systems we rarely think about. That complexity brings power and vulnerability. Ancient civilizations didn't fall because they were ignorant. They fell because they believed their systems were permanent, just like every civilization before them, just like every civilization after. The lesson of 2025 isn't fear. It's humility. Progress is real, but it is not guaranteed. Knowledge can be lost, memory can fade, and meaning can disappear if we don't actively carry it forward. That's why this series matters. Not because it cataloged discoveries, but because it reframed the story. The past isn't a closed book. It's an unfinished conversation. And every generation decides whether to listen or move on. So when you think back on everything uncovered in 2025, the cities beneath jungles, the machines beneath seas, the people beneath history, the words beneath ash, remember this: none of it survived by accident. Someone built carefully. Someone preserved intentionally. Someone hoped. And now that hope rests with us. Because one day, long after we're gone, someone else will be digging, sifting through fragments, trying to understand who we were, what we valued, what we chose to remember. And when they do, what will we have left behind that tells them the truth? Not our technology, not our wealth, not our power, but our meaning. That is the real discovery of 2025. Not that the past is full of secrets, but that it trusted the future enough to share them. And now the question is ours to answer. What will we choose to preserve? What archaeology will never find? Before we continue, let me ask you something quietly. Have you ever thought about what isn't left behind? Not the monuments, not the ruins, but the moments that vanished the instant they happened. If that question feels heavy, that's because it should. Because in 2025, After uncovering cities, machines, libraries, and lost peoples, archaeologists came face to face with something unsettling. Most of human history is gone forever, and no technology, no matter how advanced, will ever bring it back. Archaeology is powerful. It can see beneath jungles. It can read scrolls burned by volcanoes. It can reconstruct lives from fragments of bone. But even at its best, archaeology is still working with leftovers. What survives is the exception, not the rule. For every city we uncover, thousands were built entirely from wood and earth. They left no trace, no walls, no foundations, no markers. People lived there, loved there, argued there, died there, and then the land reclaimed them completely. For every text we recover, tens of thousands were never written down. Stories told aloud, songs passed by memory, knowledge taught through practice. Once the people were gone, the knowledge went with them. No ash preserved it. No stone recorded it. Silence replaced it. This realization struck archaeologists hard in 2025, not because they failed, but because they succeeded enough to see the gap. Consider language. We know thousands of ancient languages existed. We can identify them through names, inscriptions, or references. But we can only understand a fraction of them. Entire languages disappeared without leaving a single decipherable sentence, which means entire ways of thinking are gone. Forever. Language isn't just communication. It's categorization. It's how a culture divides the world. When a language dies, a worldview dies with it. Archaeologists can find tools. They can find dwellings. But they can never fully recover humor, sarcasm, irony, private jokes, the things that made people feel human to each other. They will never know what someone whispered during a storm, or what a parent said to calm a child, or what joke made a group laugh so hard they forgot the danger for a moment. And that's the part of history that hurts the most. Not the loss of grandeur, but the loss of intimacy. In 2025, this limitation became especially clear during genetic studies. Scientists could identify ghost populations, trace migrations, map relationships, but they could not answer the most basic question: how did these people understand themselves? DNA can tell us who mixed with whom. It cannot tell us who felt like an outsider. It cannot tell us who was loved, or feared, or admired. A skeleton can show signs of labor. It cannot show pride or regret. This realization forced archaeologists to reframe their work. They weren't reconstructing the past. They were approximating it. And that humility changed everything. One researcher said something that spread quietly through the field. We are not discovering the past. We are discovering what the past could not destroy. That sentence matters, because it explains why the past often feels incomplete. Not because we haven't dug enough, but because so much was never meant to last. Human beings evolved for immediacy, for presence, for shared moments, not permanence. The earliest humans didn't carve their stories into stone. They carried them, spoke them, lived them. And once the speakers were gone, the stories vanished. This is why the earliest periods of human history are the quietest. Not because nothing happened, but because everything happened too fast to leave marks. In 2025, archaeologists studying early humans found tools older than any previously known. Bone tools, fire use, intentional design. But even these discoveries only hint at what was lost. We know early humans taught each other, but we don't know how. Through imitation, through ritual, through play. We know they cooperated, but we don't know what they argued about, or what scared them most. This absence isn't a failure of science. It's a reminder of scale. Human history spans hundreds of thousands of years. Writing covers only a sliver. Archaeology covers a little more. But lived experience, that disappears almost instantly. And yet, something strange happens when you accept that. The fragments we do have become more powerful. A handprint on a cave wall. A child's footprint preserved in ash. A simple bead worn smooth by years of touch. These aren't impressive because they're old. They're impressive because they survived despite everything. In 2025, archaeologists found more examples of these fragile survivals. Tiny things, personal things, things that shouldn't have lasted. A fingerprint in ancient clay. A footprint beside a hearth. A worn tool repaired again and again instead of discarded. These objects don't tell us what civilizations believed. They tell us what individuals cared about. And that distinction matters. Because history isn't only shaped by leaders and systems. It's shaped by ordinary decisions made millions of times. The things archaeology can't recover are often the most important. Love, loyalty, fear, hope, trust. These leave no durable trace, but they drive everything else, which leads to a difficult realization. The past we reconstruct is biased. It favors durability, stone over flesh, power over tenderness. And yet, in 2025, archaeologists began to lean into this limitation instead of fighting it. They started asking better questions. Not just what survived, but what probably didn't. And when you ask that question, a different past emerges. A quieter one. A more human one. A past full of laughter that left no echo. Of arguments that ended without record. Of lives that mattered deeply to a few people and no one else. And maybe that's the most honest version of history we can ever reach. Not a perfect reconstruction, but a respectful acknowledgement of absence. Because absence tells us something too. It tells us that life is not lived for eternity. It's lived for the moment. And as archaeologists closed out 2025, that realization stayed with them. The past isn't just what we find. It's also what we'll never find. And understanding that may be the most important discovery of all. Because it prepares us for the next question. If so much is lost, why do some things survive at all? The moment's history almost lost forever. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever almost lost something important? Not because you didn't care, but because life moved too fast. A photograph nearly thrown away. A message deleted by accident. A memory you only kept because something stopped you at the last second. That feeling, that tight moment between loss and survival, sits at the heart of what archaeologists faced in 2025. Because this was the year we realized how many moments in human history came dangerously close to disappearing forever, and how fragile remembrance really is. Most people imagine history as something solid, written down, stored, archived. But in reality, history survives through near misses. Chance, accident, delay. If any one moment had gone differently, entire chapters of the human story would be gone. Take the ancient scrolls buried by volcanic ash. For centuries, they sat unnoticed, not protected by intention, protected by coincidence. If the eruption had been slightly hotter, the papyrus would have disintegrated. If it had been cooler, bacteria would have consumed it. If looters had reached the villa first, the scrolls would have been discarded as worthless debris. Any one of those things, and the voices inside would have vanished completely. The same is true for countless discoveries made in 2025. Cities beneath jungles survived only because vegetation covered them gently instead of eroding them. Shipwrecks survived because they sank just deep enough to be unreachable, but not deep enough to be crushed. Bones survived because soil chemistry happened to be balanced. History didn't survive because it was strong. It survived because it was lucky. That realization unsettled archaeologists more than any single find. Because it meant that what we call the past is not a full record. It's a narrow slice that escaped destruction by chance. Consider ancient libraries. We know from record that some cities held hundreds of thousands of texts. We have fragments of those catalogs, names of books, names of authors, but the books themselves, gone, burned in wars, recycled as packaging, left to rot. The survival rate of ancient literature is estimated at less than 1%. That means for every book we have, hundreds were lost. Now think about what that implies. Entire scientific theories, philosophical debates, medical knowledge, artistic movements, all erased. Not because they were wrong, but because the conditions that supported them collapsed. In 2025, archaeologists confronted this reality again while studying urban abandonment. Many ancient cities weren't destroyed violently. They were left. People packed what they could and walked away. But in doing so, they also abandoned archives, tools, and records that required maintenance. Papyrus doesn't survive without care. Wood rots. Ink fades. Within a few generations, entire cities became silent. What we often call mystery in archaeology is simply decay doing its job. One discovery from 2025 illustrated this painfully well. In a once thriving settlement, archaeologists uncovered a building that had collapsed inward. Inside were fragments of tablets, cracked, warped, unreadable. They were once administrative records, the kind that would have told us names, families, transactions, daily life. Instead, all that remained were broken surfaces and partial symbols. Enough to know something existed, not enough to know what it said. That partial survival is a recurring theme. We glimpse outlines, not details. We see shadows of lives, not full stories. Even human remains tell only part of the truth. A skeleton can reveal age, diet, injury. But it cannot tell us what someone believed, what they hoped, who they trusted, what broke their heart. In 2025, archaeologists working with burial sites spoke openly about this frustration. They could reconstruct rituals. They could identify patterns. But they could not recover meaning in full. Because meaning lives in context, and context disappears first. And yet, despite all this loss, some moments survived with astonishing clarity. A footprint preserved in ancient mud. A fingerprint pressed into clay thousands of years ago. A child's handprint on a cave wall. These moments weren't preserved because they were important. They were preserved because they were accidental. No one intended for those prints to last. No one marked them for posterity. They endured because conditions aligned just right. And now they speak across millennia. In 2025, discoveries like these took on new emotional weight. Not because they were rare, but because they felt intimate. A footprint isn't a symbol of power. It's proof of presence. Someone was here. Someone walked. Someone lived long enough to leave this mark. This is where archaeology becomes personal. Because the same is true for us. Most of what we do will not survive. Most of what we say will not be remembered. And yet occasionally, something small will persist. A photograph, a recording, a message saved by accident. In that sense, ancient people aren't different from us. They didn't expect eternity. They expected tomorrow. This understanding reshaped how archaeologists frame discoveries in 2025. They stopped asking only, "What does this tell us?" and started asking, "What almost didn't make it?" One team studying a floodplain realized that an entire settlement survived only because flooding patterns shifted temporarily. If the river had changed course slightly earlier, the site would have been erased completely. Another team discovered that a cache of tools survived because a landslide sealed them off. Without that landslide, looters would have taken them centuries ago. Time and again, history survived not because it was preserved carefully, but because destruction missed it by inches. That realization brings humility, because it reminds us that our understanding of the past is provisional, partial, fragile. In 2025, some archaeologists began using a new phrase: survivorship bias of history. We study what survived and mistake it for what mattered most. But what mattered most often didn't survive at all. Love letters on papyrus, children's toys made of wood, songs sung by firelight, gone. And yet the near misses matter, because they show us what survival looks like. Not grandeur, but vulnerability. The things that almost vanished and didn't tend to share certain traits. They were personal, unintended for preservation, embedded in daily life. This suggests something profound. Human legacy is not built through monuments alone. It emerges through ordinary moments that happen to endure. That realization casts the discoveries of 2025 in a different light. The most powerful finds weren't always the biggest. They were the ones that made us feel close to someone who never imagined being remembered. And that brings us to the final question before this journey ends. If history survives by chance, if meaning persists through accident, then what role do we play? Are we just beneficiaries of luck? Or do we have agency? That question leads directly to the final part of this extended series. Because after confronting what archaeology can't find, and what it almost lost, we arrive at the quietest and most important realization of all. Some things survive not by chance, but by choice. Before we end this story, let me speak to you quietly for a moment. If you've made it this far, it's not because you wanted more information. It's because something inside you recognizes what this is really about. You're not just curious about the past. You're thinking about what lasts, about what matters enough to carry forward, about whether anything we do truly survives time. That question isn't philosophical. It's human. And in 2025, archaeology revealed the final, uncomfortable truth. Some things survive not by chance, but because someone somewhere chose to protect them. Throughout this entire journey, we've talked about accidents, cities saved by jungle cover, scrolls preserved by volcanic ash, shipwrecks protected by depth. Luck plays a role, but luck alone does not explain everything that made it through time. Because alongside the accidents, archaeology uncovered something else: intent. In 2025, researchers began to notice a quiet pattern running through the discoveries. Certain objects weren't merely buried. They were prepared, wrapped, catalogued, positioned carefully, sealed with effort. These weren't the remains of collapse. They were acts of foresight. Think about that for a moment. Someone stood at the edge of uncertainty, war, collapse, invasion, climate stress, and made a decision. Not to flee with everything. Not to destroy what couldn't be taken, but to leave something behind on purpose. For someone they would never meet. That act requires imagination, the belief that the future will exist, and that someone in it will care. We saw this in hidden archives. Texts sealed away instead of burned. Knowledge protected from political shifts. Not because it was useless, but because it was powerful. We saw it in burials. Not rushed, not careless, but tender. Objects chosen not for value, but for meaning. A comb, a ring, a tool worn smooth by years of use. Someone saying this mattered. We saw it in architecture. Buildings aligned with the stars. Plazas placed at the heart of cities. Spaces meant for gathering, ritual memory. Even when the city failed, those spaces endured longest. Because people returned to them. This is the part of history that doesn't show up in timelines. Choice. Archaeology often focuses on what happened. But 2025 reminded us to ask something else. Why did someone decide this was worth saving? When you ask that question, the past stops being abstract. It becomes intimate. The people who hid texts didn't know they would be rediscovered. They didn't know what language the future would speak. They didn't know if anyone would ever understand what they preserved. They only knew one thing. This should not disappear. That instinct is ancient, and it's still with us. We see it today when someone backs up photos they don't want to lose. When someone keeps letters long after they've lost practical value. When someone saves a story and passes it on even when no one asked. These are small acts. But history is built from small acts repeated millions of times. One archaeologist involved in the 2025 discoveries said something quietly powerful. The past survives where fear met hope and hope won. That sentence matters because fear alone destroys. Hope preserves. When people believe the future is worth talking to, they leave messages. Not always words. Sometimes objects. Sometimes places. Sometimes patterns carved into stone. That is why certain things endure when everything else fades. Not because they were strongest, but because someone believed in continuity. And here is the part we rarely say out loud. Those people were wrong and right. Wrong because their world still ended. Right because something of them reached us. Which means their effort mattered. As 2025 came to a close, archaeologists began to see themselves differently. Not as the end of the story, but as one link in a chain. They weren't discovering history. They were receiving it. And once you accept that, a question becomes unavoidable. What are we leaving behind? Not our skyscrapers, not our technology. Those are temporary. Servers fail, formats change, power grids go dark. What endures are things with meaning embedded inside them. Stories, values, care. This is why the discoveries of 2025 didn't feel triumphant. They felt sobering, because they showed us how much effort it takes for anything human to survive time. The past is not generous. It is selective, and selection favors intention. We often imagine future generations judging us by our greatest achievements. But archaeology teaches a different lesson. They will judge us by what we protected. Did we preserve knowledge widely, or concentrate it until it became fragile? Did we record our voices, or allow them to disappear into systems that won't last? Did we care enough to leave something understandable? These questions are not abstract. They are practical. Because one day, our present will be someone else's excavation. They will not see our lives as we lived them. They will see fragments, ruins, artifacts stripped of context, and they will try to reconstruct meaning. Just as we do, they will ask, who were these people? What did they value? What did they fear? What did they love enough to save? And here is the quiet truth archaeology revealed in 2025. History is not written by the winners. It is written by the remembered. And remembrance is not automatic. It is chosen. The ancient people who hid texts, sealed tombs, and preserved symbols didn't do so because they were certain of survival. They did it because uncertainty made the act necessary. Which brings us to the final realization of this entire journey. The past is not asking us to admire it. It is asking us to participate. Every generation becomes the past faster than it expects. And every generation decides, often unconsciously, what it leaves behind. Archaeology doesn't just uncover ruins. It uncovers responsibility. If you felt something watching this series, a pull, a heaviness, a sense of connection, that's not coincidence. It's recognition. You are part of the same human pattern. You preserve. You remember. You care. And that means the story doesn't end with discovery. It continues with choice. So when we ask what survived from ancient civilizations, the real answer isn't cities or machines or texts. It's the belief that someone would listen. That belief crossed thousands of years, and now it rests with us. The past trusted the future. Now the future must decide what to do with that trust. That is the final lesson of 2025. And it is not about archaeology. It is about humanity.